Alright, it's going.
Alright guys, give Mr. Glick our attention.
The cool guy, the essential one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Alright guys, so today, as Mr. Miller said, we're going to talk about the Crusades. So you guys got kind of an introduction to the topic on Friday. So today we're just going to go a little bit more in depth. So our essential question for today is to try to figure out why the Europeans invaded the Holy Land. Okay, so by placing the Europeans as invaders, we're looking at this more from an Arabic standpoint, right? Because they're the ones who were being invaded. But this question, I think it's fairly open-ended, and there's a lot of arguments that could be made for various answers. These arguments include there was religious motivation, there was political motivation, there was like money, wealth was a motivating factor. So these things, as we work through this lecture, I want you guys to kind of be thinking about this question and coming up with an answer that you feel is valid. So first, we kind of need to understand the background, what the scenario was in the Middle East at this time, basically the circumstances for why the Crusades happened. Now the land that we know as the Middle East today was at one point under the control of the Roman Empire. Right? The Roman Empire controlled basically all of the Mediterranean world and much of what we call the Middle East today. Now around in the middle of that is like the 4th century, 5th century, there was a split in the Roman Empire. They divided it into a Western Roman Empire that was located in Rome and an Eastern Roman Empire that was located in Constantinople. Now this Eastern Roman Empire, we typically refer to it as the Byzantine Empire. Has anyone ever heard of the Byzantines? Yeah? Cool. So just remember the Byzantine Empire, we're talking about that eastern half of the Roman Empire. And so it was the Byzantine Empire that controlled the lands such as Jerusalem and Damascus, things that we know today as the Middle East. And at this time, a group called the Seljuk Turks, they were an ethnic group that came out of Central Asia. They migrated into this region. And through their migration, they started to take land from the Byzantines. They started to conquer some Byzantine land. And through this process, they eventually came to control the town of Jerusalem. So the Seljuk Turks have taken Jerusalem. They're taking land from the Byzantine Empire. And this is the stage that the Crusades are built upon. So the Byzantine emperor at this time was a man by the name of Alexius. And Alexius, he made a plea to the Pope. He called up Pope Urban II, and he said, hey, I need help. These Seljuk Turks, they're coming in, they're taking over my land, they're killing my people. I'm not as prestigious or as powerful as I once was, and I need your help. So Pope Urban II, at a conference called the Conference of Clermont, he gathered together a bunch of European Christians, and he proclaimed that there should be a crusade. He raised the call for crusade, saying that Christians should take up arms and go reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Now at this point in time, Alexios, in his asking for aid, he had no real religious motivation. He was basically just trying to get some soldiers who could come help him defeat the Turks. But Pope Urban, he spun it, right? He put a little spin on the idea of crusading and made it religious in nature. And by doing this, he placed Jerusalem as the centerpiece of the crusade. The idea that we need to go recapture Jerusalem. And to do this, he integrated it into the concept of pilgrimage. Do you guys know what pilgrimage is? We talked about it a little bit with the 5 pillars of Islam. Do you remember?
Is it really raid?
It's not where they raid, but you're kind of on the right track.
Or like steal resources?
No. So a pilgrimage is a journey to a religious site or a religious shrine. So for Christians, this meant that they would travel to Jerusalem, they would take a journey to Jerusalem, and in doing so, they would hope to gain some religious favor with God. Now this could be through penance, which means forgiveness of sins. So the idea was that if you made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, your sins would be forgiven, And in doing so, you would guarantee your spot in heaven. So this is the idea that Pope Urban floated out to the people of Europe, saying, hey, if we enter into this crusade and we go and recapture Jerusalem, this will count as your pilgrimage. Then this will ensure your admission to heaven. So he spun it and put this religious motivation behind it, and that's what really created a lot of swell in Europe. Right? There were a lot of people that were really excited by this idea. It was their entry into heaven. It was something that affected their eternal life. So a lot of people got on board with this concept. So the First Crusade rose up around the year 1096. That's when they arrived in the Middle East. They had started mustering in Europe a few years prior to this. But in this First Crusade, there was no real cohesion among the Crusaders. The force was made up of 4 armies, each from 4 different regions of Europe. So you have these 4 armies from 4 regions with 4 different leaders. They weren't communicating with one another. They weren't all focused on the same goal. So it was a little chaotic at the time. Not a whole lot of communication. And think, this is the Middle East. There is, or not the Middle East, this is pre-medieval times. There is no quick forms of communication. There is no overarching bureaucratic system that could help all these crusaders get on the same page. So when they meet up in Constantinople, they're all kind of separate, but all with the idea that they're going to go take Jerusalem. So they meet up in Constantinople, which is the center of power for the Byzantine Empire. And from Constantinople, they march across the desert down to the Middle East. The first town that they come up to, or the first town that they try to capture, is a town by the name of Antioch. And they're successful in capturing this town. Now at this time, the region, the ones that they're fighting is the group known as the Seljuk Turks. Well, the Seljuk Turks were one of many empires or groups of people that lived throughout the Middle East. And so the people of the Middle East were not a unified force against the Crusaders. So in this first crusade, the Crusaders were able to basically be fairly successful in their goals. They were able to conquer a lot of land, take a lot of wealth and plunder for Europe because the Muslims weren't united against them, and also the Muslims didn't know they were coming. Imagine the Muslims, they're just sitting there minding their own business, and all of a sudden an army of thousands, tens of thousands show up at their doorsteps. Unprovoked, they didn't know it was coming. So that gave the Christians a leg up. Now around the time that they were able to conquer the town of Antioch, a group called the Fatimid Egyptians came up from Egypt and took over Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks. Now why this matters is because the Seljuk Turks, they were Sunni Muslims, and the Egyptian Fatimids were Shia Muslims. So these are 2 conflicting groups. So the Fatimids, they were happy to see the Seljuk Turks kicked out of Antioch. And vice versa, the Turks were glad to see the Fatimid Egyptians defeated. They're not unified against the Crusaders. So as the Crusaders move into Jerusalem, they eventually take the city from the Egyptians, but it takes a siege. They have to place the city under siege before it falls, and it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of death before the city finally falls. But since this was the end goal, the main goal of the First Crusade, they're done. A lot of them head back to Europe. Now what they do with the land that they've conquered, they create these 4 Crusader kingdoms, okay, or Crusader states. There was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Antioch, the Kingdom of Edessa, and the Kingdom of Tripoli. And so the Europeans, they brought in their own rulers, they brought in their own citizens to govern these regions and to control them while the armies went back to Europe. So there's a time of relative peace in the region while these Crusader states are running. There's about 100 years where the Crusader states are able to be strong and to hold the gains that they've got in this region, but slowly over time Muslims start to regroup and they start to take back some of their territory. Now it's also at this time that the concept of a jihad is put forth in regard to the Crusades. Can someone tell me what a jihad is? Yeah.
Holy war.
A holy war, exactly. So remember at the beginning, the Christians showed up in the land with a religious motivation, but the Muslims didn't know that what they were encountering was religiously motivated. But over time, as the Muslims lived in the land, the conquered Muslims lived in that land, they established their own jihad. They realized that this was religiously motivated, what the Christians were doing. And so to match that, they had to implement their own religious holy war. And so this is when the concept starts to change a little bit. Now the Second Crusade, for the most part, was a failure for Europe, so we won't go too far in depth. But it all started when the northernmost Crusader kingdom of Edessa was conquered by Muslims. So of the 4 kingdoms, one of them falls, and that creates a lot of backlash in Europe. People are not happy about this. They want to get back to the Middle East and retake this land. So the 2 main people to know with the Second Crusade is King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. They were the 2 main leaders of Europe who answered the Pope's call with regard to the Second Crusade. But in the end, it was a defeat for the Europeans. So now the Third Crusade, this is the one that is most often talked about. It's the one that's best remembered in our memory. It's often romanticized by historians. And this is all, the Third Crusade all came about because a man by the name of Saladin rose to power throughout the Middle East. Now Saladin was a Kurd from Egypt, and he was a great military general, a great leader. And Saladin was able to come out of Egypt, and he was able to gain control over almost the entirety of the Middle East. He was able to capture the city of Damascus in present-day Syria, and he was able to capture the city of Jerusalem as well. Now the fall of these 2 cities, Damascus and Jerusalem, is what created the backlash in Europe. So the Christians, they saw these 2 cities fall, and that was their motivation for going on to this Third Crusade. Now 3 important key players in the Third Crusade are the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, King Philip II of France, and most importantly, King Richard the Lionheart of England. Have you guys all seen the cartoon Robin Hood, like the Disney Robin Hood film? Yeah. So King Richard the Lionheart is the guy down here. He's from that Robin Hood film. Right, so in the film, King Richard has gone away on crusade, and that's what leads to the circumstances in England. So this guy, King Richard, he's a really, really big figure in history, a really big figure in European history. And he is part of the reason why we remember this crusade so well. So Richard and Saladin, they're the 2 main players, basically they're the 2 people that caused this crusade to be so well remembered. Now these men were both great military leaders, both great generals, but this crusade only featured one pitched battle. It was a battle at the Battle of Arsuf, where King Richard and his forces fought against Saladin and his forces. King Richard was successful in this battle. He was victorious, and this allowed him to capture the port city of Jaffa. Now from Jaffa, Richard was able to move about into his main goal with coming to this Third Crusade was the capturing of Jerusalem. So from Jaffa, he was able to lead his men to the town of Jerusalem, and he got right outside the city walls when he realized that he would never be able to take the city. He didn't have the manpower necessary to lay siege, he didn't have the resources, and he didn't have the time. It would have been impossible for him to take over the city. So what he does is he signs a treaty with Saladin. They get together, they have a little powwow, and what happens is Richard is able to reestablish what's called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now the catch is that this newly formulated, or this reestablishing of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, did not include the actual town of Jerusalem. So it's kind of a win-win for both sides, right? King Richard can go back feeling good about himself. He can go back to Europe and say, hey, I recaptured the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But he didn't have the city. So it was Saladin was able to retain control of the city, but Richard was able to feel good because he made at least some headway in the region. Now the legacy out of this crusade, as I stated earlier, this one gets romanticized. We remember it very well, and that is primarily because there are these big players, these big characters that capture our imagination. So we think about King Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin, And it's this great example of a good guy versus a bad guy, if you're looking at this through a European lens, right? It's two characters fighting it out against each other. You can see in the painting down below, King Richard facing off one-on-one combat with Saladin. That never happened. They didn't actually meet each other in battle, but it's a fun thing to think about, right? If you're a European, you're thinking about your hero going against their hero, and this idea of chivalry and knighthood and combat, and it all being moral and majestic. This also began to shift the focus of the Crusades. So the first two Crusades were primarily motivated by religious reasons, right? Pilgrimage, the idea of penance, gaining entry into heaven. But with this crusade, we start to see the focus shift more towards money and power and wealth and bureaucracy, political nature. So the idea that we're not simply going to the Middle East to better our own standing with God, but we can go there and we can get rich while we're doing it. And also, it shifted the focus from the Middle East to Egypt. So the problem with this is that Egypt has no real religious significance to Christians. So with the Holy Land, there was a number of shrines and sites that Christians would go on pilgrimage to, but Egypt doesn't have that. There are no pilgrimage sites in Egypt. So now people are having to work through, oh, we're going to attack this region with no religious implications. And this all came about because King Richard, he was again a great military man, and he was looking at the map one day, and he realized that if you want to capture Jerusalem, it's much easier, it's a much shorter journey to go up through Egypt than it is to come down from Turkey. So instead of marching his men over a long, hot desert, if you were to try to come from Constantinople down, it's much easier to come up through the south. And so that takes us into the Fourth Crusade, where they implemented King Richard's tactics. They tried to attack Jerusalem, or they tried to recapture Jerusalem by going through Egypt. Now remember, Saladin is from Egypt, and one of the seats of his empire is located in Egypt, so that was also a motivation for wanting to go through there. But the main reason is because it's a shorter journey to Jerusalem. So in this Fourth Crusade, they wanted to transport their troops to Egypt through the Mediterranean. They wanted to use ships instead of sending the men over land. So to do this, they contacted the Venetians. Venice is a town on the east coast of Italy. They're prolific traders throughout the Mediterranean. They're very good at building ships and utilizing ships. So the Crusaders went to Venice looking for ships. The Venetians said, yes, we'll build you ships. But by the time the Crusaders got there to pick up the ships, they didn't have enough gold to pay for them. They couldn't afford the ships. So what happened was, Venice said, we'll cut you a deal. We have this town that is under our control that is in open rebellion, this town by the name of Zara. And they said, you have a question?
I was going to say, yeah, wasn't the town run by Christians?
Yeah, yep. So this town of Zara, it's a Christian town. But regardless, the Crusaders go and they sack the city, they take it over and they kill people. Now as you pointed out, Zara is a Christian town. So what we're seeing here is the Crusaders are now attacking other Christians. And the Pope, he doesn't like that. So what the Pope does is he excommunicates them. Does anyone know what excommunication is? Disowning them? Yeah. So basically the Pope disowned the Crusaders and their leaders. He said, you are no longer a part of this church. You no longer have any say in religious matters. And also, by the way, you're going to hell. Your soul can no longer be saved. So that was a lot of weight on the Crusaders, right? Their church basically disowned them, kicked them out. So they had no real motivation for what they were to do next. And this is where the Byzantine emperor by the name of Alexius III stepped in. He said, all right, Crusaders, I'm having some political issues here. There's some political turmoil here in Byzantium. If I pay you, will you come help me sort this matter out? Basically, there was a claim, he had a claim for the throne, and he wanted the Crusaders to help him gain that throne. So the Crusaders did it. They went to Constantinople, they helped Alexius gain the throne, and then they just sat around and waited to get paid, because he had promised to pay them for their efforts. Well, shortly after this, Alexius loses his throne, he is deposed, and the new emperor who comes in says, no, I did not make this deal with you, Crusaders, I will not pay you. So what do you guys think the Crusaders did?
Flashback.
They killed everybody. They went in and they attacked the city, sacked the city, killed its people, plundered its wealth, and then left. And why this is so important is because Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It was at this point in time, it is a city more magnificent than Rome. And by sacking the city, they did such damage that the Byzantine Empire never was able to recover. Within 250 years, the Byzantine Empire had completely fallen. The Ottoman Turks were able to come in and take over, control the region, and they controlled that region until World War I. So the legacy of the Fourth Crusade, one of the main points that it has brought about is that this idea that the Crusaders had where any enemy of the Catholic Church is fair game. So when they were killing people in Constantinople, the people of Constantinople were primarily Christians. But they were not Catholics. They were a part of what's known as the Orthodox Church. Now the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church split at some point during the Roman Empire time period. And this split is what we call the schism. Right? Does anybody know what schism means? So schism basically just means tearing apart. Think of it as a chasm, two things splitting from each other. So you have in the West the Catholic Church, and in the East the Orthodox Church, and they split. There is a gap between these two. And what happens at Constantinople only widens that gap, only makes the disagreement between East and West increase. And then as I said before, it weakened Constantinople in such a way that they would never recover. Yeah?
Didn't a new king come in and kick out Alexius, and he was not Catholic, but what'd you say was
Orthodox?
Orthodox. He was an Orthodox, and he came in and kicked Alexius out.
Mm. All right. So over the course of the next 100 years, there were various other crusading efforts. None of them really amounted to much, so we're not going to really talk about them. But from this, one of the main things I want you guys to take away is that a lot of these efforts centered on driving non-Christians out of Europe. So a lot of these final crusades weren't necessarily even focused on the Holy Land itself. They were more focused on, think of it as like a purge. They wanted to purge Europe of groups that were non-Christians. So think Jews, Muslims, pagans, and even Orthodox Christians were all subject to some of these later crusades. So the effects of the Crusades, if we're thinking about this from a European point of view, the Crusades greatly increased the wealth and power of the Catholic Church and the Pope. Right? Much of the plunder and the wealth that was taken out of the Holy Land was given to the Catholic Church and the Pope. So these ventures, sometimes the popes would, if they were a little bit short on cash, if they needed some quick funds, they would call for a crusade as a way to generate revenue. This also increased trade throughout mainland Europe, as well as increasing trade between Europe and the Middle East. Right? So you have a large influx of people going between the two regions, and as they're doing that, they're sharing ideas and information and goods of that nature. So they're opening up doorways to other cultures. This phenomenon also laid the groundwork for the Renaissance that we'll see a few hundred years later, as people began to be interested in travel and science and learning. But as a downside, these crusades were incredibly expensive. It was incredibly expensive for a ruler to not only equip himself with arms and armor, but to equip his lords, his nobles, and his men as well. So these monarchs had large financial burdens to themselves, went about these crusades, and that often caused life back at home to become really, really bad, right? Taxes skyrocketed, much of the financial burden was placed upon the peasants themselves, and oftentimes when the leaders were off crusading, think Robin Hood, with how King Richard is off crusading and his brother, who is a bad ruler, is able to assume power. That happened a lot throughout Europe as the monarchs left. Think if our president were to go away on war. Like, that would leave a vacuum of power, right? So then the effects of the Crusades, looking at it from the Arabic side, it created this bitter resentment between Muslims and the Europeans. So as the Muslims, they viewed it as an unprovocated invasion of their space, an invasion of their land. So obviously, they did not like the Europeans. They didn't like that they came in unprovoked and took things from them. They also saw that the Crusaders were indiscriminate in regards to killing. Can someone tell me what the word indiscriminate means? Yeah. It means they would kill everyone alike. They did not discriminate among their victims. Very good. So they would kill Jews, they would kill Muslims, they would kill non-Christians, and they would kill Christians. And what this did was, as the Muslims saw this, in their minds, they conceived the Crusaders as being immoral, right? Because they saw them, there was no rhyme nor reason to them killing people. They just saw that they were bloodthirsty, immoral men. And that really framed how they conceptualized Christianity and the Crusaders themselves. And we're still dealing with these repercussions today. It's not nearly as violent or as volatile as it was at this time, but there still is a great distinction between the two regions. Okay.
You want to go ahead and explain?
Yes. Does anyone have any questions before we wrap it up?
We got about a minute.
Alright, so this worksheet that Mr. Miller's handing out, basically it's called a 3-2-1. All I want from you is 3 things. Just write down 3 things that you learned about the Crusades, 2 questions that you might still have, or inquiries about the Crusades, and then in 1 sentence, answer that question down at the bottom.
Guys, we'll wait until the beginning of class tomorrow to get our 3 questions. You just have to remind me tomorrow at the beginning of the class. Sound good? Everybody understand this? Everybody good there? Alright, so we got a couple things. We got this. We got a quiz on Tacitus and a quiz on the terms of the Crusades. Okay? Joey, did you say something? Yes, yes. Make sure you got a hard copy ready to go. Alright, appreciate you guys' attention today. Thanks, Mr. Glenn.
Yeah.
You got one more? You alright for one more?
I think the next one starts at 45, because then you got 45 minutes.
On the schedule, it shows that we get out at 45 in this class.
Yeah. Your depth in understanding as well as your presentation and your vocabulary, very impressive for a young guy. Oh, let's nix this. Get my positive